The parlor into which Inspector Crane conducted Whimsy was precisely what he had anticipated. Chintz curtains, a mantelpiece crowded with porcelain figurines, and the sort of furniture that suggested comfort had been sacrificed entirely upon the altar of good taste. Mr. Ashworth, it appeared, had been a man of conventional aesthetic sensibilities. The room smelled faintly of beeswax and something else, something floral that Whimsy eventually identified as dried lavender in a rather overwrought sachet. "The household staff?" Whimsy inquired, settling himself into a wing-backed chair with the deliberate care of a man seating himself upon an unexploded bomb. 3 servants in residence, Crane consulted his notebook with the gravity of a man consulting an ancient text. Mrs. Blackwell, the housekeeper, been with the family for 20 years. Thomas Hardy, the groundskeeper, discovered the body at approximately 6 o'clock this morning whilst preparing the gardens. And Miss Eleanor Graves, the companion and secretary, she handled much of Mr. Ashworth's correspondence and domestic arrangements. "Companion," Whimsy repeated mildly. "How very Victorian, and how are we to interpret that particular arrangement? Was Miss Graves a woman of a certain age providing economical service, or was she something rather more engaging?" Crane shifted uncomfortably. "She's 32, sir. Rather striking in appearance, if one is being honest." Some of the village ladies had begun to gossip, naturally. Though there was nothing improper, or so everyone insists. Of course, they insist. That is what people do when there is, in fact, something decidedly improper. Has anyone considered that gossip itself might constitute a motive? A woman of 32, dependent upon a man of 53 for her livelihood, suddenly finds herself the subject of village speculation. Such things can become rather wearing. Whimsy paused, studying the inspector with an expression of theatrical sympathy. "Tell me, had Mr. Ashworth any relatives? Any heirs who might have anticipated a substantial windfall?" "A nephew," Crane said promptly. "Mr. Robert Ashworth, aged 28. Currently residing in London, though he arrived by rail yesterday afternoon, claimed he'd received word of his uncle's condition and felt obliged to attend upon him." "How thoughtful," Whimsy observed dryly. "And was his uncle in a condition requiring such familial devotion at the moment of his nephew's arrival, or did Mr. Robert's timing prove rather more fortuitous?" "That's precisely the puzzle, sir. Mr. Cyril was apparently in excellent health. Dined well the previous evening, retired at his customary hour around 10:30, and was found dead in the garden by 6 o'clock the following morning." Whimsy rose and moved toward the window, gazing out upon the immaculate grounds beyond. The rose garden was visible even from this distance, a geometric composition of beds arranged with almost obsessive precision, each plant staked and supported with the attentiveness of a devoted collector. The thought of that garden as the setting for a theatrical death scene struck him as almost deliberately insulting. "The poison," he said without turning from the window, "was detected in the bread itself you mentioned? And this bread, where did it originate? Surely you've had it analyzed? Mrs. Blackwell did not bake it herself, I presume?" "No, sir." "That's one of the genuine peculiarities. The bread appears to have come from the village bakery, Mrs. Pritchard's establishment on High Street. However, Mrs. Pritchard insists no such loaf was delivered to Thornfield Manor yesterday morning, and her records show no such purchase. The baker is quite firm on the point. She remembers every order, and Mr. Ashworth's account typically involved only a single small loaf twice weekly on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And yesterday was Wednesday, Whimsy observed, turning back to face the inspector with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Which suggests that either someone from the household visited the bakery and purchased this particular loaf without informing you, or it was obtained from another source entirely, and poison, I should note, is not the sort of ingredient one typically requests when placing a standing order at a respectable village bakery." Crane's face reddened slightly. We've only just begun our inquiries, sir. Haven't had the opportunity to question the staff thoroughly regarding their movements yesterday. Then shall we do so now? Whimsy suggested with deceptive pleasantness. I find that human memory is a remarkably fluid substance, rather like watercolor paint left in the rain. The longer one allows it to settle and dry, the more stubborn it becomes. Fresh testimonies are invariably the most honest, even when they are lies. He paused, then added almost as an afterthought, I should also like to examine Mr. Ashworth's correspondence, particularly anything from Miss Graves or his nephew. And the body itself, naturally. One cannot form any coherent conclusions regarding the manner of death without observing how the poison was administered. A loaf of bread wedged into a man's mouth suggests either remarkable strength or remarkable cooperation from the victim himself. The inspector stared at him blankly. Cooperation, sir? Indeed, Whimsy said, already moving toward the door. Either Mr. Cyril Ashworth was forced by main strength to ingest poisoned bread whilst unconscious or restrained, or he was persuaded to do so by someone he trusted. The second option, I suspect, is considerably more likely, and considerably more interesting. Shall we begin? Mrs. Blackwell occupied a small sitting room adjacent to the kitchens, a space that spoke volumes about domestic hierarchy and the particular loneliness of her position. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with the sort of face that had been handsome once before being worn smooth by decades of service and discretion. Her hands, when she clasped them together in her lap, trembled almost imperceptibly. I've been with the manor for 20 years, she began, before Whimsy had even settled himself into the offered chair. Mr. Ashworth was a good employer. Fair, if distant, he kept to his routines, did not make unreasonable demands, and paid his wages promptly on the first of each month. There was nothing irregular about the household, Lord Peter. Nothing at all. How reassuring, Whimsy said, his tone suggesting that reassurance was precisely the last thing he found in such declarations. Though I wonder if you might clarify something for me, Mrs. Blackwell. When you say nothing irregular, do you mean nothing you observed, or nothing that actually occurred? Because those two propositions, whilst appearing superficially identical, are in fact quite distinct creatures. The housekeeper's face paled slightly. I'm sure I don't understand, sir. No, I suspect you understand perfectly well, but you are a woman of professional discretion, a quality I admire and would not dream of violating. However, I am not your employer, and therefore your loyalty to Mr. Ashworth's memory need not extend to protecting whatever secrets his household harbored. Tell me about Miss Graves. Mrs. Blackwell's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Miss Graves is a respectable young woman. She came highly recommended, and her work has always been satisfactory. I'm sure she did, and I'm sure it was, Whimsy replied. His fingers steepled before him in an attitude of profound thoughtfulness. But that is not what I asked. I asked you to tell me about her. What sort of woman is she? What are her habits, her temperament, her relationship with Mr. Ashworth? Does she dine with him, or does she take her meals separately? Does she ever leave the manor unaccompanied, and if so, how frequently and at what hours? For a long moment, Mrs. Blackwell remained silent. Then, with the air of a woman making a confession she had long considered but never quite articulated, she began to speak. Miss Graves is clever, sir. Very clever. Too clever, perhaps, for a woman in her position. She reads constantly, not novels, mind you, but serious books. History, philosophy, that sort of thing. Mr. Ashworth rather enjoyed their conversations about literature and current events. He relied upon her for managing his affairs, reading his correspondence, even advising him on financial matters. A woman of capability, Whimsy observed. And yet she remained in a position of dependency? That suggests either remarkable loyalty or remarkable calculation. Which would you say it was?" Mrs. Blackwell's hands twisted together. "I wouldn't presume to judge, sir. Of course you would. You have been judging her for some considerable time, I suspect, and forming opinions quite independently of what propriety dictates you should express. But I will not press you on the matter of Miss Graves's moral character. Instead, let us discuss something more concrete. Yesterday morning, what was Miss Graves's behavior? Was she her customary self, or did you observe anything unusual?" "She seemed distracted," Mrs. Blackwell admitted reluctantly. "She asked me if I intended to visit the village, and when I said I was going to the post office, she inquired whether I might stop at the bakery, which was unusual, because Mr. Ashworth's bread came by standing arrangement on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She seemed rather insistent that I bring back a fresh loaf, though she didn't explain why." Whimsy's eyes gleamed with interest. "And did you comply with this request?" "I did, sir. But when I returned, Miss Graves said Mr. Ashworth had decided against the extra bread after all, and asked if I might dispose of it. I thought it wasteful, but she was quite firm on the matter." "Where did you dispose of it, Mrs. Blackwell?" "I fed it to the garden birds, sir. Scattered it about the grounds near the rose garden. Mr. Ashworth was fond of birds, though he pretended not to be. I thought he wouldn't mind." Whimsy rose abruptly and moved to the window overlooking the gardens. The implications were beginning to arrange themselves like pieces upon a chessboard, though the final configuration remained frustratingly obscure. Either Miss Graves had purchased poisoned bread and then abandoned it upon learning that her scheme would be discovered, or she had purchased unpoisoned bread and someone else had substituted it with deadly intent. The distinction mattered considerably. "One final question, Mrs. Blackwell," he said without turning from the window. "What is your assessment of Mr. Robert Ashworth? How would you characterize his relationship with his uncle?" "Cold, sir," Mrs. Blackwell replied without hesitation. "The nephew has visited perhaps 3 times in the past 5 years. They exchanged polite conversation, but little more. I gained the impression that Mr. Cyril regarded his nephew as rather disappointing. The boy has struggled with employment and seems perpetually short of funds." "How very convenient," Whimsy murmured. "A nephew in financial distress arriving at the manor on the very day his uncle consumes poisoned bread. One begins to suspect that this case, for all its theatrical absurdity, may harbor motives of a rather conventional nature. However, convenience and guilt are not identical propositions, and I should very much like to examine the body before forming any premature conclusions." He turned back to face the housekeeper. "You may return to your duties, Mrs. Blackwell. You have been most illuminating." The local police surgeon, Dr. Hartwell, had conducted his preliminary examination in the manor's study, a room that seemed to Whimsy an unlikely venue for the inspection of mortal remains. The doctor was a nervous man of perhaps 55, with the sort of hands that trembled slightly whilst handling instruments. Not the ideal temperament for a medical professional, though Whimsy had long since observed that ideal temperaments were rarely distributed where they might prove most useful. "The poison appears to be strychnine," Dr. Hartwell began, consulting his notes with the air of a man reading from a script he had rehearsed extensively. "Though the concentration is somewhat unusual. One would expect more violent convulsions if the dose were as substantial as the quantity discovered in the bread suggests. The body shows signs of muscular rigidity, certainly, but the facial expression is almost peaceful. Rather at odds with strychnine poisoning, if I'm being honest." Whimsy bent over the corpse with the meticulous attention of a scholar examining a medieval manuscript. Mr. Cyril Ashworth presented as a man who had taken considerable care with his appearance in life. His fingernails were manicured, his hair neatly trimmed, his clothing of good quality if somewhat ostentatious. His mouth, however, bore the marks of the indignity that had preceded his death. The jaw showed signs of bruising, and the lips were split where they had been forced open to accommodate the bread that had been his final meal. The bruising suggests considerable violence, Whimsy observed, his fingers hovering just above the discoloration without quite making contact. This was not a passive acceptance of poisoned bread, Dr. Hartwell. Someone forced Mr. Ashworth's jaw open and wedged that loaf between his teeth with deliberate force. The question, naturally, is whether this occurred before or after his death. That is precisely what I cannot determine with certainty, Dr. Hartwell admitted. The strychnine would have acted quite rapidly, within minutes of ingestion, one would expect. If the bread was forced into his mouth post-mortem, the bruising might have occurred during the act, but there would be no physiological reason for such violence, unless the perpetrator was acting from rage or some compulsive need to degrade the body. Or unless, Whimsy said quietly, the perpetrator was ensuring that the poisoned bread remained in place long enough for Mr. Ashworth to swallow a sufficient quantity. If the bread was inserted whilst he was still conscious, forcibly inserted, then Mr. Ashworth might have attempted to spit it out. The murderer would have needed to hold his victim's mouth shut to prevent him from expelling the poisoned substance before it could take effect. He straightened, his expression thoughtful. The timeline is crucial, Doctor. What do we know of Mr. Ashworth's final hours? When was he last observed alive by members of the household? According to Miss Graves' statement, Hartwell consulted his notes. Mr. Ashworth took his evening meal at 7 o'clock. He retired to his study afterward to attend to correspondence. Miss Graves brought him a cup of cocoa at approximately 9:30 and left him to his reading. She heard nothing unusual during the night, and the groundskeeper discovered him at 6 o'clock this morning in the rose garden. So we are working within a window of approximately 8 to 9 hours. The body has been exposed to the elements, which would complicate matters considerably. Whimsy moved toward the window, observing the gardens beyond with an intensity that suggested he was cataloguing every detail for future reference. Tell me, what was the weather yesterday evening? Was it raining? Clear? Cold? Dr. Hartwell appeared puzzled by the question. Clear, actually. Quite mild for October. The ground would have been damp from the previous day's rain, but yesterday itself was dry. How very interesting, Whimsy murmured. Because if Mr. Ashworth was moved from his study to the rose garden sometime between, say, 10 o'clock in the evening and 6 o'clock in the morning, then whoever transported him would have been visible to anyone happening to glance from a window. A man does not simply vanish from his study and reappear in his prize rose garden without someone noticing, unless of course that someone had been deliberately stationed to ensure their own non-observation. You're suggesting the murderer deliberately avoided being seen? Hartwell asked uncertainly. I'm suggesting nothing of the sort. Whimsy replied, with a slight smile. I'm merely observing that either Mr. Ashworth walked to the rose garden of his own volition and consumed the poisoned bread there, or someone removed him there whilst unconscious or already deceased. The first proposition requires that he voluntarily ingested poison baked into bread, an action that demands either complete ignorance of the bread's contents or a form of suicide by proxy. The second requires that he was moved a considerable distance through a house containing at least 2 other residents without anyone observing or hearing him. He turned back to face the doctor. Has anyone examined Mr. Ashworth's study? I should like to see precisely where he was last known to be alive. Inspector Crane conducted a preliminary examination, Hartwell said, but I believe he found nothing of particular significance. The room was neat, undisturbed. There was no sign of struggle. Then we must examine it with considerably more care than the inspector possesses, Whimsy said briskly. Because either Mr. Ashworth's study contains evidence that the inspector overlooked, or it contains an absence of evidence that is itself profoundly significant. Come, Dr. Hartwell, let us see what Mr. Cyril Ashworth's final sanctuary reveals about the manner of his death. The study occupied the eastern wing of Thornfield Manor, a room that bore all the hallmarks of a man's private sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, their contents arranged with meticulous precision, classics of literature interspersed with volumes on banking, economics, and what appeared to be an extensive collection of works on rose cultivation. The 4th wall was dominated by a substantial mahogany desk, upon which sat an array of correspondence, a leather-bound journal, and a silver inkwell positioned with geometric exactitude. Whimsy moved through the room with the deliberation of a man conducting an archaeological expedition, his eyes cataloguing every detail whilst his mind assessed the psychological implications of the space. A man's study, he had long observed, revealed far more about his character than any conversation could accomplish. Mr. Cyril Ashworth's study suggested a person of orderly temperament, considerable vanity, and perhaps a touch of obsessive compulsion. The books were alphabetized by author. The desk surface, though cluttered with papers, maintained an implicit organizational logic that only its owner would fully comprehend. "Notice anything peculiar?" Whimsy asked, settling himself into the leather chair before the desk without bothering to request permission. Dr. Hartwell stood uncertainly in the doorway. "It appears rather neat, actually. One might have expected signs of disturbance if there had been a struggle." "Exactly," Whimsy said, his attention fixed upon the desk's surface. "There are no signs of disturbance, because there was no struggle. Mr. Ashworth was either already unconscious or entirely complicit in his own demise. But observe, here are the evening's correspondence, still arranged as though he had been reading through them. The journal remains open to Wednesday's entry. The inkwell is uncapped, suggesting he had been in the process of writing or reading recently. And yet, according to Miss Graves, he took his cocoa at 9:30 and settled in to read. One would expect to find evidence of that reading, a book positioned upon the desk, perhaps, or a cup with residue indicating the cocoa had been consumed. He leaned back in the chair, his fingers steepled before him. "Where, Dr. Hartwell, is the cup in which Miss Graves supposedly brought him his cocoa?" The doctor's face went pale. I hadn't noticed its absence." "Of course you hadn't. Absence is remarkably easy to overlook. It is presence that commands attention. But a woman brings a man a cup of cocoa at 9:30, claims to have left him reading, and yet that cup vanishes entirely. Either it was never brought to this room, or it was removed sometime during the night by someone with access to the study." Whimsy rose and moved toward the bookshelves, running his finger along the spines of the rose cultivation volumes. "Tell me, has anyone examined the cocoa for traces of poison?" "No," Hartwell admitted. "We have only Miss Graves' assertion that she brought it. If the cup itself is missing, then Miss Graves has either lied about bringing it, or someone has removed it to prevent analysis. The question is which, and more importantly, why?" Whimsy selected a slim volume titled The Cultivation of Hybrid Roses in the English Climate and examined its spine. This has been read recently. The binding shows signs of wear, suggesting frequent consultation. Our Mr. Ashworth was not merely a casual gardener, but an enthusiast of considerable dedication. A knock at the study door interrupted his examination. Inspector Crane entered with the air of a man carrying urgent news. "Lord Peter, we've had a development. Young Mr. Robert Ashworth has gone missing. His room is empty, his bag is packed, and the head groom reports that the fastest horse in the stable disappeared sometime last night. We're having the railway stations alerted, but you're wondering if his departure constitutes an admission of guilt," Whimsy finished smoothly. "How very gratifying. A suspect flees the scene of a crime, and suddenly the investigation acquires a shape and momentum of its own. Inspector, I wonder if you might do me a considerable favor and have someone search Mr. Roberts' room for any evidence of correspondence with his uncle. Letters, notes, anything that might illuminate their relationship." "You think the nephew poisoned him?" Crane asked eagerly. I think the nephew's flight is remarkably convenient and requires investigation, Whimsy replied with deliberate ambiguity. However, convenience and guilt are not identical propositions. A man may flee for reasons entirely unrelated to murder, fear of entanglement, debts, personal scandals. The fact that he has chosen to depart at precisely this moment is interesting, but it is not conclusive. He turned his attention back to Dr. Hartwell. The cocoa cup. Have you any notion of where it might be? Would Miss Graves have left it in this room, or might she have taken it back to the kitchens for washing? I never thought to ask, the doctor admitted. Then we must ask now, Whimsy said, moving toward the door. Inspector, I should like to speak with Miss Graves immediately, and I would appreciate access to the kitchens, the scullery, and any refuse disposal areas the household maintains. If that cup was used to administer poison, it must have been disposed of somewhere. It will not have simply evaporated. As they departed the study, Whimsy paused at the threshold, his eyes returning once more to the open journal upon the desk. He had not yet examined its contents, but something about its position troubled him, as though it had been deliberately positioned for observation or perhaps deliberately abandoned mid-entry. He made a mental note to return to it when he had gathered somewhat more intelligence. The household was beginning to unravel, he reflected with quiet satisfaction. The threads were there, tangled and complex, but becoming visible to anyone possessed of sufficient patience to trace them to their source. Miss Eleanor Graves received them in the morning room with a composure that Whimsy found decidedly instructive. She was, as Crane had noted, striking in appearance, dark hair arranged with careful simplicity, eyes of an unusual gray-green that suggested intelligence rather than mere beauty. Her hands, however, betrayed a tension that her face did not. They twisted together in her lap with the desperation of a drowning woman clutching at driftwood. I have already provided a statement to Inspector Crane, she began, before Whimsy had even settled himself opposite her. I fail to understand why further interrogation is necessary. Interrogation is such an unpleasant word, Whimsy observed mildly, crossing his legs with deliberate casualness. I should prefer to think of this as a conversation between reasonable people attempting to clarify certain minor inconsistencies. For instance, Mrs. Blackwell has informed us that you requested she purchase an extra loaf of bread from the village bakery yesterday morning, a request somewhat at variance with Mr. Ashworth's customary arrangements. Perhaps you might explain the reasoning behind this unusual request? For the briefest moment, something flickered across Miss Graves's face. Not quite fear, but something approaching alarm. She mastered it with commendable swiftness. Mr. Ashworth had mentioned that his appetite had been improving. I thought an additional loaf might be welcome. How considerate, Whimsy said, his tone suggesting he found it anything but. And yet when Mrs. Blackwell returned with the bread, you asked her to dispose of it. That is a remarkable reversal of solicitude, wouldn't you say? One moment you are concerned about Mr. Ashworth's appetite, the next you are insisting the bread be given to the birds. Surely you can understand how that might appear contradictory? I changed my mind, Miss Graves said firmly. Mr. Ashworth decided against it. I requested that Mrs. Blackwell discard it rather than waste his time with explanations. On his behalf, you mean? Whimsy asked. Without consulting him directly? That suggests a considerable degree of familiarity and authority. Tell me, Miss Graves, how long have you been employed at Thornfield Manor? 3 years, she replied. I came with excellent references from my previous employer. And in those 3 years, you have apparently acquired sufficient influence over Mr. Ashworth's domestic arrangements to make decisions regarding his meals without his direct input. Mrs. Blackwell mentioned that he valued your conversation, that he consulted you on matters of literature and finance. Quite an unusual relationship between an employer and his employee, would you not say? There is nothing improper in an educated employer valuing the conversation of an educated employee, Miss Graves said coldly. Mr. Ashworth was a lonely man. He had few friends in the village, and his family paid him little attention. I provided intellectual companionship. That is hardly scandalous. I never suggested it was, Whimsy replied with an innocence that managed to imply the opposite. However, I wonder if you might clarify the nature of your relationship with Mr. Robert Ashworth. Mrs. Blackwell indicated that their interactions were formal and distant. Yet your own connections to the household would presumably have exposed you to the nephew's company during his occasional visits. What was your assessment of their relationship? They were civil to one another, Miss Graves said. Nothing more. And yet, Mr. Robert arrived yesterday, precisely at the moment when his uncle was about to consume poisoned bread. Surely you must find that timing somewhat remarkable? I find it coincidental, Miss Graves replied, her voice tightening. Nothing more. Whimsy leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. The missing cocoa cup troubles me, Miss Graves. You claim to have brought Mr. Ashworth cocoa at 9:30 in the evening, yet that cup has vanished entirely. Mrs. Blackwell did not collect it from the study, Dr. Hartwell did not observe it, and it is not amongst the scullery items awaiting washing. One might conclude either that it was never brought to the study or that someone has deliberately removed it to prevent its analysis. I brought it, Miss Graves said quietly. I am certain of that. What happened to it after I left the study, I cannot say. Did Mr. Ashworth seem unusually drowsy that evening? Whimsy pressed. Did he comment upon the taste of the cocoa or express any discomfort? He seemed perfectly normal. He thanked me and returned his attention to his papers. That is all. Whimsy studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, abruptly, he rose. The journal on his desk, have you any notion of what he was writing yesterday evening? Had he mentioned anything he intended to record? No, Miss Graves replied. Mr. Ashworth kept his personal affairs entirely private. Yet you were his companion and secretary. Surely you must have had some awareness of his correspondence, his financial concerns, his domestic arrangements. Of course, Miss Graves acknowledged. But his personal journal was beyond the scope of my duties. Whimsy moved toward the door, then paused. One final question, Miss Graves, and I should appreciate a direct answer. Did you purchase poisoned bread intending to administer it to Mr. Ashworth, or did someone substitute poisoned bread for the loaf you acquired at Mrs. Pritchard's bakery? I did neither, Miss Graves said firmly, and I resent the implication. Resentment and guilt are not mutually exclusive, Whimsy observed. However, I note that you have not answered my question with the vehemence one might expect from an innocent person. You have merely denied my accusation. There is a subtle but significant distinction between those two responses. He opened the door, then glanced back. Where is Mr. Robert at this moment? I have no idea, Miss Graves replied. I assumed he had merely taken a horse for an early ride. How very convenient, Whimsy murmured. Inspector Crane has informed me that the horse has not yet returned, and neither, apparently, has Mr. Robert. One begins to wonder if he ever intended to return at all. You may consider yourself confined to Thornfield Manor pending further investigation, Miss Graves. Inspector Crane will ensure you are not troubled by the local constabulary, but I should advise against any attempt at departure. The kitchens of Thornfield Manor occupied the lower level of the house, a sprawling domain of copper pots, marble surfaces, and a cast-iron range that spoke of considerable culinary ambition. The scullery maid, a nervous girl of perhaps 19 named Dorothy, stood wringing her apron as Whimsy conducted his inspection with the meticulous precision of a man searching for a specific needle in an exceptionally large haystack. The cocoa cup, Whimsy repeated for the third time, his attention fixed upon the array of vessels drying upon the wooden racks. "You washed the dishes yesterday evening. Did you happen to observe a cocoa cup amongst them?" "There was no cup, sir," Dorothy insisted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I collected the supper dishes around 8 o'clock, as I always do, and then again after 9:30 when Miss Graves brought back the serving tray from the parlor. There were only the usual items: plates, glasses, cutlery. No cocoa cup." "And you are entirely certain of this?" Whimsy asked, his expression suggesting he knew precisely what answer he would receive. "Quite certain, sir. I remember thinking it odd, actually, that there was no cocoa cup. Miss Graves usually brings one down after Mr. Ashworth's evening cocoa. But yesterday there was nothing." Inspector Crane, who had been observing from the doorway with the air of a man watching a conjuring trick he did not quite understand, stepped forward. "Perhaps Mr. Ashworth drank it in his study and disposed of it himself?" "Possible, but unlikely," Whimsy replied, moving toward the refuse bin positioned near the scullery entrance. "Mr. Ashworth appears to have been a man of considerable fastidiousness regarding domestic arrangements. He would hardly dispose of a cup himself when servants were employed for that purpose. However, let us examine what has been discarded." The bin contained the usual detritus of a household: vegetable peelings, meat scraps, tea leaves, fragments of bread. Whimsy sifted through it with the concentration of an archaeologist excavating an ancient site, his movements deliberate and unhurried. At the bottom, beneath a layer of damp tea leaves, he discovered something that made him pause: a ceramic handle, white and delicate, attached to a substantial fragment of what had clearly been a china cup. "Well," he murmured, extracting the pieces with care, "here is our cocoa cup, or at least what remains of it. Someone has taken considerable pains to break it into sufficiently small fragments that it would be unlikely to be discovered during a cursory examination. Shall we have these pieces sent to Dr. Hartwell for analysis? I suspect we shall find traces of strychnine, along with what remains of cocoa and milk." Inspector Crane's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. "Then the poison was administered in the cocoa." Miss Graves must have done something," Whimsy interrupted smoothly, "but I am not yet prepared to conclude precisely what. The cup was broken deliberately, which suggests someone wished to prevent its analysis. However, that someone need not necessarily be the person who administered the poison. They might simply be someone who wished to obscure evidence of the true method of poisoning." He turned back to Dorothy. "Tell me, yesterday evening, did you observe anything unusual in Miss Graves's demeanor when she returned the serving tray? Was she distressed, hurried, or did she display any signs of guilt?" "She seemed perfectly calm, sir," Dorothy replied, "though she did ask me specifically to ensure all the dinner dishes were washed thoroughly and placed away before bed, which was odd, because she never usually concerns herself with my work." "How very interesting," Whimsy mused, "a request to ensure thorough washing, as though she wished to eliminate any potential evidence. And yet she failed to account for the possibility that fragments of the cup might survive in the refuse. A clever murderer would have disposed of the cup more thoroughly, perhaps burned it, or removed it from the house entirely. Breaking it and placing it in the bin suggests either panic or a degree of confidence that the bin would not be thoroughly examined." He moved toward the door, his mind visibly working through the implications of what he had discovered. "Inspector, I should like you to have the kitchen staff questioned regarding their movements yesterday evening. Specifically, I wish to know whether anyone observed Miss Graves in the kitchens between the time she brought Mr. Ashworth his cocoa and the time she supposedly retired for the evening. Additionally, I should like access to the household accounts and any records of Miss Graves's financial transactions. You believe she purchased the poison? Crane asked. I believe nothing of the sort at this moment, Whimsy replied with deliberate evasion. I am simply gathering information. However, I begin to suspect that this case involves considerably more complexity than a simple matter of poisoning. The missing bread loaf, the deliberately destroyed cup, the nephew's precipitous departure, these are all elements of a larger pattern that is only now beginning to emerge. He paused in the corridor, his expression suddenly thoughtful. Tell me, Inspector, has anyone examined the rose garden itself in detail, the place where Mr. Ashworth was discovered? The body was removed early this morning, Crane replied. But I can have the area examined more thoroughly if you believe it significant. I believe it may be profoundly significant, Whimsy said. Because if Mr. Ashworth consumed the poisoned cocoa in his study, then he must have walked to the rose garden under his own power, or been moved there post-mortem. Either scenario tells us something crucial about the nature of the poison and the timeline of his death. Come, let us examine the garden. I have a theory developing, and I should very much like to test it against the physical evidence. The rose garden presented itself as a study in controlled beauty, geometric beds arranged with mathematical precision, each plant supported by carefully positioned stakes, the gravel paths raked to uniform smoothness. It was, Whimsy reflected, the sort of garden that demanded constant attention, constant vigilance against the encroachment of nature's disorder. Such gardens revealed something of their creator's psychology. They suggested a man terrified of chaos, desperately attempting to impose order upon an indifferent universe. The spot where Mr. Ashworth had been discovered was marked by a slight discoloration in the gravel, a faint darkening that might have been blood or merely damp earth. Whimsy stood at the center of the garden, his eyes moving methodically across the surrounding landscape. The manor house with its mullioned windows, the servants' quarters visible through the trees, the high hedge that bordered the property on three sides. Notice anything? He asked Inspector Crane, who stood beside him with the air of a man attending a lecture he did not fully comprehend. The location is rather exposed, Crane ventured. Anyone in the house might have observed him here, had they chanced to look out a window. Indeed, Whimsy agreed. Which raises an interesting question. If Mr. Ashworth walked here under his own power, why choose a location so visible, so open to observation? Why not dispose of himself or be disposed of in the woods beyond the hedge or in some secluded corner of the grounds? The rose garden is your prized possession, your obsession, your carefully maintained sanctuary. Why choose it as the location for your death? He knelt beside the discolored patch, examining the gravel with intense scrutiny. Small stones, recently disturbed, suggested that something had been dragged across them. The pattern was faint, but it was there, a trail leading from the garden toward the house itself. Someone moved him, Whimsy said quietly. Not from the study to the rose garden, but perhaps from the rose garden itself to ensure he was positioned precisely as the murderer intended. The question is why? What significance does this particular location possess? Inspector Crane gestured uncertainly. His roses were prize specimens. He had won several competitions at horticultural shows. But I fail to see how that, because you are not thinking like a murderer, Whimsy interrupted. A murderer does not simply wish to kill. He wishes to communicate something through the manner of killing. The poisoned bread, the crude forcing of it into Mr. Ashworth's mouth, the theatrical placement in his beloved garden, these are not the actions of someone seeking a clean, efficient death. These are the actions of someone wishing to mock, to degrade, to express contempt. He rose, brushing gravel from his trousers. The journal in his study was positioned upon his desk as though he had been reading or writing in it. But we found no evidence that he had actually been working there. No pen positioned as though recently used, no ink upon his fingers. Someone arranged that scene. Someone wished us to believe he had been peacefully occupied in his study when, in fact, something quite different was occurring. "You believe he was poisoned elsewhere?" Crane asked. "I believe he was poisoned, and then the scene was carefully staged to suggest a particular narrative," Whimsy replied. "But which narrative? Was it intended to suggest he died peacefully in his study, only to be later discovered in his garden? Or was it intended to suggest he was moved from one location to another by someone with knowledge of his habits and routines?" A commotion from the direction of the manor interrupted his ruminations. A constable came hurrying across the lawn, his face flushed with exertion. "Lord Peters, sir." "Inspector. We've received word from the railway station at Ashford. A man matching Mr. Robert Ashworth's description boarded the London train this morning at 7 o'clock. But here's the peculiar thing. He arrived at the station on horseback, yes, but he wasn't alone. There was a woman with him." Whimsy's eyes narrowed with acute interest. "A woman? Did the station master provide any description?" "Dark-haired, well-dressed, carrying a small bag." The station master thought she might be accompanying the gentleman, but he wasn't entirely certain whether they traveled together or merely arrived at the station at the same time. "Fascinating," Whimsy murmured. "Miss Graves has apparently overcome her confinement to the manor with remarkable speed." "Inspector, I suggest you telegraph ahead to London, and have both the station and the principal hotels alerted. However, I rather suspect they will not be found. At least, not in London. They have far too much intelligence to remain anywhere so obvious." He began walking back toward the manor, his mind visibly assembling and reassembling the pieces of the puzzle. The timeline is becoming clearer, though the full picture remains obscured. Mr. Ashworth dies from poisoned cocoa administered by Miss Graves, or so the evidence suggests. Yet Miss Graves departs with his nephew at dawn, which suggests either complicity or coercion. The nephew arrives yesterday specifically at the moment of his uncle's death, which is either remarkable coincidence or carefully orchestrated planning. They reach the terrace overlooking the gardens. Whimsy paused, turning back to study the rose garden from this elevated vantage point. "You can see the entire garden from here," he observed. "Anyone in the house would have an unobstructed view of Mr. Ashworth's body being positioned amongst his beloved roses. Which means the murderer either positioned the body at a time when no one would be observing, or positioned it with complete indifference to observation. Both possibilities are instructive." "What do you intend to do now?" Crane asked. "I intend to return to Mr. Ashworth's study and examine his journal with considerably more attention than I afforded it previously," Whimsy replied, "because I suspect that document contains the key to understanding not merely how he died, but why he died, and more importantly, why someone believed him worth killing in such an elaborate and theatrical manner." The study seemed to have acquired a peculiar quality in Whimsy's absence, as though the room itself had been waiting for his return, holding its secrets in patient silence. The journal remained upon the desk precisely as he had left it, its pages open to Wednesday's entry, the leather cover bearing the faint impression of fingers that had gripped it recently, and with considerable force. Whimsy settled himself into the leather chair and began to read, his expression growing progressively more thoughtful. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical in its regularity, suggesting a man of methodical temperament. The entry itself was brief, consisting of only 3 paragraphs. Wednesday, 14th October. Eleanor mentioned today that Robert has written requesting funds again. The boy is becoming increasingly burdensome. I have informed her that I shall not respond to his letters. He must learn that financial responsibility is not merely a matter of wheedling money from relatives. My roses are performing exceptionally this season. The hybrid specimens are particularly promising. I have no doubt they shall secure first place at the autumn show. Eleanor seems distracted of late. I have noticed her reviewing the household accounts with greater frequency than usual, and her manner has become somewhat distant. I wonder if she is becoming fatigued with the position. It would be unfortunate, as her company has become indispensable to my existence in this isolated place. I have decided to alter my will. Eleanor deserves recognition for her years of faithful service. Perhaps a small bequest will secure her future and demonstrate my appreciation. Whimsy read the passage twice more, his fingers drumming thoughtfully upon the desk's surface. Then he rose and moved to the bookshelves, withdrawing the several volumes on rose cultivation. He examined them with meticulous care, discovering in the margins of one, a particularly worn copy, several annotations in a hand distinctly different from that which had inscribed the journal. The annotations were detailed and technical, discussing hybrid variations, soil composition, and cultivation methods. But interspersed amongst these horticultural notes were phrases of a more personal nature. One in particular caught Whimsy's attention, underlined heavily. The rose does not flourish through neglect. It requires constant attention, constant feeding, constant renewal. Without it, the finest specimen will wither and die. "Inspector," Whimsy called, his voice sharp with sudden urgency. "I require information regarding Mr. Ashworth's finances. Has anyone examined his banking records, his accounts, his recent transactions?" Crane appeared in the doorway. "We've begun preliminary inquiries, but then I suggest you accelerate them," Whimsy interrupted. "Specifically, I wish to know whether any substantial sums have been withdrawn recently, or whether large payments have been made to individuals outside the household. Additionally, I require information about his will. Who is his solicitor? When was the document last revised?" "His solicitor is Mr. Edmund Fairfax in the village," Crane replied. "I can send for him immediately if you believe, do so," Whimsy commanded. "And Inspector, one more matter. I should like to know whether there is a second Mrs. Ashworth, whether he has been married previously, divorced, or separated. The notebook I examined earlier suggested he has been married, though there was no evidence of a current spouse. Clarify this for me." Crane departed with alacrity, leaving Whimsy alone with his thoughts and the accumulated detritus of a dead man's private life. He returned to the journal, reading through the preceding pages with methodical attention. The entries spanned several months, each one a small window into Mr. Ashworth's interior world, his observations on the garden, his reflections upon literature, his occasional irritations with the village society. But it was an entry from 3 months prior that caused him to pause. "Eleanor has disclosed a matter of considerable delicacy. Her family circumstances are somewhat straitened, and her mother suffers from a chronic condition requiring expensive treatment. I have been moved by her candor and have offered to provide financial assistance. She was reluctant to accept, but I was insistent. A man in my position has few opportunities to employ his wealth meaningfully. To do so for one who has proven herself worthy of such consideration seems the proper course." Below this entry, in what appeared to be a different pen, were words that had been heavily crossed out but remained faintly legible. "I wonder if I am being foolish. Eleanor's gratitude seems genuine, yet there is something in her manner that suggests calculation. But I am perhaps simply a suspicious old man, lonely and eager to interpret any kindness as evidence of affection." Whimsy closed the journal thoughtfully. The narrative was becoming disturbingly clear, yet it did not entirely account for the theatrical manner of Mr. Ashworth's death. A murderer motivated by greed might poison a benefactor. That was a crime as old as civilization itself. But the poisoned bread, the crude forcing of it into the victim's mouth, the deliberate placement in the rose garden, these suggested something more visceral than mere financial desperation. The door opened, and Bunter entered with the quiet efficiency that characterized his every movement. "A telegram, sir, from the London office. The individuals matching the descriptions of Mr. Robert Ashworth and Miss Eleanor Graves boarded a cross-channel steamer this morning. The destination is listed as Calais, from which any number of continental routes would be available to them." "How very convenient," Whimsy murmured. "They are covering their tracks with admirable efficiency. However, I suspect they will not travel far before the money runs out, and money, Bunter, I am becoming increasingly convinced, was never their primary objective." He rose and began pacing, his mind assembling the final pieces of the puzzle. "The rose garden, Bunter. Why the rose garden? Why display the body in Mr. Ashworth's most treasured possession? Why force poisoned bread into his mouth with such deliberate indignity?" "I confess I am uncertain, sir," Bunter replied. "Because," Whimsy said slowly, "someone wished to mock him. Someone wished to degrade him, to reduce him from a man of consequence to an object of ridicule displayed amongst his own precious flowers. That suggests personal animosity, not merely calculated greed." He turned to face his valet with sudden intensity. "Send for Mr. Fairfax immediately. I believe he holds the final piece of this puzzle." Mr. Edmund Fairfax arrived within the hour, a solicitor of perhaps 60 years, with the cautious demeanor of a man who had spent his lifetime protecting other people's secrets. His face bore the pallor of someone who had received news of catastrophe, and his hands trembled slightly as Whimsy gestured him toward a chair in the study. "A dreadful business," Fairfax began immediately, before any pleasantries could be exchanged. "Quite extraordinary. When Inspector Crane's constable informed me of Mr. Ashworth's death, I was profoundly shocked. A man in seemingly good health, taken so suddenly and in such a manner, it scarcely seems credible." "Indeed," Whimsy replied, settling himself opposite the solicitor with an air of casual interest. "However, I find that death, once properly examined, often yields credible explanations. Mr. Fairfax, I understand you are Mr. Ashworth's legal representative. I wonder if you might clarify certain matters regarding his will, his previous marriages, and his financial arrangements." Fairfax stiffened noticeably. "Such matters are ordinarily privileged, Lord Peter. Client confidentiality is generally respected when the client is alive," Whimsy interrupted smoothly. "However, Mr. Ashworth is deceased under circumstances that suggest criminal activity. I suspect you will find that providing information to facilitate the investigation is not merely advisable but necessary. Inspector Crane can, if you prefer, obtain a warrant. However, that would be a considerably more tedious process for everyone involved." The solicitor shifted uncomfortably, clearly warring with professional ethics and practical necessity. Finally, he withdrew a leather portfolio from his briefcase. "Mr. Ashworth has been my client for nearly 30 years. During that time, there have been certain complications in his personal affairs." "Complications?" Whimsy prompted. "He was married once, in his youth, to a woman named Catherine Winters. The marriage was dissolved approximately 25 years ago under rather distressing circumstances. Mrs. Ashworth departed for the continent, and Mr. Ashworth subsequently endeavored to distance himself from that period of his life entirely. The dissolution was quite acrimonious, I understand, though the financial settlement was generous." "And did Mr. Ashworth maintain any contact with his former wife?" "Not to my knowledge," Fairfax replied. "However, approximately 6 months ago, Mr. Ashworth received a letter. He did not disclose its contents, but he was considerably distressed. He consulted me regarding whether the woman could make any claims upon his estate. Whimsy's eyes narrowed with acute interest. A letter from his former wife? That was my initial assumption, Fairfax said. However, Mr. Ashworth's subsequent questions suggested the letter may have come from someone else, perhaps a relation of Mrs. Ashworth's. He was particularly concerned about whether he bore any legal responsibility for a child born subsequent to the dissolution of the marriage. A child, Whimsy repeated softly. Tell me, Mr. Fairfax, do you happen to know the age of this child? Or the identity of the individual who wrote to Mr. Ashworth regarding this matter? The letter was unsigned, Fairfax replied. But based upon the timeline Mr. Ashworth described, the child would be approximately 26 or 27 years of age. The pieces seemed to shift and realign with sudden, violent clarity. Whimsy rose and moved to the window, his gaze fixed upon the rose garden below. And Miss Eleanor Graves? Do you happen to know her age? I am not entirely certain, Fairfax admitted. 32, perhaps? I have never had cause to examine her documentation closely. 32 is rather convenient, Whimsy mused. Just old enough to be the legitimate product of Mr. Ashworth's marriage to Mrs. Catherine Winters. Just old enough to have been born before the divorce, yet raised entirely outside his knowledge or acknowledgement. He turned back to face the solicitor. Mr. Fairfax, I require you to examine Mr. Ashworth's recent will revision. Specifically, I wish to know whether Miss Graves was named as a beneficiary, and if so, what provision was made for her. Fairfax consulted the document he had brought with him, his expression growing increasingly uncomfortable. Mr. Ashworth came to me approximately 1 month ago and requested that I revise his will. He was quite insistent upon secrecy regarding the matter. The new provisions grant Miss Eleanor Graves the sum of £50,000, plus a cottage on the manor grounds and an annual stipend for life. A generous provision, Whimsy observed. And this revision was made despite his financial concerns regarding potential claims from his former wife's family? The two matters seemed entirely separate in Mr. Ashworth's mind, Fairfax said defensively. When he discussed the bequest to Miss Graves, he mentioned it as recognition of her faithful service. The concerns regarding his former wife appeared to be an entirely distinct anxiety, or they were connected in a manner that only became apparent once Miss Graves herself made certain disclosures, Whimsy suggested. Tell me, Mr. Fairfax, when Mr. Ashworth came to you 1 month ago requesting the will revision, did he appear distressed, anxious, or under any form of emotional duress? He was troubled, Fairfax admitted, as though he were making a decision that went against his inclinations, but which he nonetheless felt compelled to make. I asked if everything was satisfactory, and he insisted everything was fine, merely that he had been remiss in acknowledging certain obligations. Whimsy returned to the chair and sat with deliberate slowness, his expression darkening with comprehension. Mr. Ashworth was being blackmailed. Miss Graves discovered her true parentage and approached him with this knowledge. Rather than acknowledge her openly, which would have exposed him to considerable village scandal and potentially to claims from his former wife's family, he chose to purchase her silence through a generous financial settlement. That is a serious accusation, Fairfax protested. It is a logical deduction, Whimsy replied. However, blackmail, whilst morally repugnant, is not typically punished by poisoning and theatrical desecration of the victim's body. Something occurred between the will revision and yesterday that transformed Miss Graves' status from a woman engaged in subtle extortion to a woman willing to commit murder. And that something, I suspect, involves Mr. Robert Ashworth. He leaned forward with sudden intensity. Tell me, Mr. Fairfax, when Mr. Ashworth initially expressed concern about potential claims from his former wife's family, did he mention receiving any communication from his nephew regarding financial matters? The solicitor's face went pale. How could you possibly? Yes, actually. Mr. Ashworth mentioned that Robert had written requesting a substantial loan. Mr. Ashworth had refused, which is why he had consulted me regarding his obligations. He was concerned that Robert might attempt to exploit his anxieties regarding his former family. Of course, Whimsy said quietly, Robert required money. Eleanor required acknowledgement and financial security. They discovered one another's vulnerability and decided to exploit it jointly. But something went catastrophically wrong. Whimsy dismissed Mr. Fairfax with a courtesy that masked the intensity of his concentration, and immediately summoned Inspector Crane to the study. The pieces of the puzzle had arranged themselves with such crystalline clarity that he wondered how they could have remained obscured for so long. Yet that, he reflected, was always the nature of murder. It revealed itself only to those willing to examine the psychological motivations beneath the physical evidence. The bread loaf, he said without preamble as Crane entered. Have we ascertained its origin with absolute certainty? Mrs. Pritchard at the bakery has examined samples, Crane replied. She is adamant that it did not originate from her establishment. She uses a particular flour blend from a miller in the next village, and the bread in question contains a different type entirely. We are attempting to trace its source, but it originated from London, Whimsy interrupted. Robert Ashworth purchased it in London before arriving at Thornfield Manor yesterday afternoon. He brought it with him as part of an elaborate scheme that had been planned in meticulous detail. Consider the arrangement, Inspector. Eleanor discovered her true parentage, perhaps through a letter from her mother, perhaps through some other means. She approached Robert with this knowledge, presenting it as leverage. Robert, perpetually in financial distress, recognized an opportunity. Together they devised a plan to extract money from their uncle. He rose and began pacing, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of exposition. The initial scheme was simple blackmail. Eleanor would extract a financial confession from her uncle in exchange for her silence regarding her true identity. The will revision was the first step. Mr. Ashworth, frightened of scandal and anxious about potential claims from his former wife's family, agreed to provide Eleanor with a substantial bequest and annual stipend. For a time, this arrangement satisfied everyone. Eleanor received her security, Robert received promises of future assistance, and Mr. Ashworth purchased temporary peace. But something changed, Crane said slowly, beginning to follow the thread of logic. Precisely. Whimsy confirmed. Robert arrived yesterday with the poisoned bread. He had written to Eleanor informing her of his plan to intensify the blackmail, to extract not merely a single bequest, but a substantial portion of Mr. Ashworth's liquid assets. Eleanor, upon reflection, realized that this escalation would trigger investigation. Financial investigators would be called in, lawyers would examine the transactions, and the entire scheme would unravel. More importantly, she had begun to develop genuine affection for Mr. Ashworth. His kindness, his intellectual companionship, his vulnerability, these had awakened in her something approaching filial love. Whimsy paused at the window, observing the rose garden below. Robert did not anticipate Eleanor's resistance. He assumed she would cooperate in extracting maximum financial benefit from their uncle. When she refused, when she informed him that she intended to confess everything to Mr. Ashworth and beg his forgiveness, Robert became enraged. He had gambled everything on this scheme, had committed himself entirely to the extraction of money. Eleanor's sudden development of conscience threatened to destroy his plans. Robert poisoned the bread, Crane breathed. Robert poisoned the bread with the intention of murdering his uncle, yes, Whimsy said. But Eleanor discovered his plan before it could be executed. She intercepted the bread, but faced an impossible dilemma. If she destroyed it, Robert would simply acquire more poison and attempt again. If she revealed his plan to Mr. Ashworth, the family scandal would be catastrophic. If she simply allowed events to proceed, her uncle would die. So she made a decision that was simultaneously merciful and monstrous. He turned from the window, his expression grave. Eleanor administered the poison herself, but she did so in the cocoa rather than in the poisoned bread Robert had provided. A smaller dose, administered by someone who bore genuine affection for her victim. She perhaps believed it would appear a natural death, a sudden cardiac event, something that would not trigger extensive investigation. Mr. Ashworth would be spared the indignity of poisoned bread forced into his mouth. He would simply slip away peacefully. But that does not explain the theatrical display in the rose garden, Crane objected. That was Robert's contribution, Whimsy replied quietly. After Eleanor administered the poison and left her uncle's study, Robert acted upon his original plan. He discovered his uncle already dead or dying, and in a rage at having his perfect murder corrupted by Eleanor's interference, he enacted his own version of the death. He forced the poisoned bread into his uncle's mouth, recreating the murder he had intended to commit himself. He then moved the body to the rose garden, the location of Mr. Ashworth's greatest pride and obsession, placing him there as a grotesque trophy. It was an act of contempt, a final mockery of the man who had refused him money. And Eleanor allowed him to do this? Crane asked incredulously. Eleanor discovered what Robert had done only after the fact, Whimsy explained. At that point, she faced another impossible choice. Reveal Robert's desecration of his uncle's corpse and face complicity in the murder, or flee with him and hope that the investigation would focus upon the theatrical method of death rather than the mundane psychological motivations beneath it. She chose flight, convinced that with Robert absent and the investigation confused by the elaborate staging, the truth would remain hidden. Whimsy moved toward the door. Send telegrams to the continental ports. Eleanor Graves and Robert Ashworth will be found within the month. Eleanor because her conscience will torment her into confession, Robert because his rage will eventually drive him to violence against someone else. But for now, we have solved the murder. What remains is merely the mechanics of apprehension and the tiresome business of legal proceedings. He paused at the threshold, his expression weary. A tragedy, Inspector, from beginning to end. A man who wished only for companionship and intellectual engagement, destroyed by his own loneliness. A woman seeking acknowledgement and security, corrupted into murder by her own affection. And a nephew whose greed and rage transformed a simple act of poisoning into a grotesque performance of contempt. The rose garden will never look the same to anyone who knew him, and that, perhaps, is the cruelest punishment of all.